We've been having a lot of discussions. I would imagine the reason for that, that the nature or the topics of our discussions is because we, as everybody knows, we are living in unusual times. Everybody sees there's something different about what's going on now. The descent of civilization in ways that it's hard to believe how deteriorated civilization is and so on. So everybody feels there are things going on and so on, So we've been having a lot of, let's call it messianic discussions. But so in light of that, I'd like to go into a topic which is very important. And actually, some of them are very surprising and so on, And that is that the Mashiach himself, the Messiah, how do we bring him? What are the ways that we can actually bring the Mashiach that Chazal tell us, that actually work? So I'd like to mention 4 of them that can actually bring Mashiach and so on, and why they can bring Mashiach. So I thought that would be a very interesting discussion, or to give a shir on and so on, this topic and so on. Before I begin, let me just make a dedication that this shir should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Benjamin Wolf, ben Tzvi Baruch ben Benjamin Wolf, and also Shmuel Reuven ben Regina should have refuah Shalema, and Esther Libo Bas Chaya Yafa should have a complete refuah Shalema. Yes. And I might add Zev Wolf ben Rochelea should have refuah Shalema. Okay. So that's what I'd like to talk about. How does one bring the Mashiach? And I'm going to mention certain ideas about how he could come and so on, And it's really very interesting to think about these ideas. Yes. What's interesting about that is, from what I'm going to say, you realize that 3 of them out of the 4, I'm going to give you 4 of them, that Chazal say can bring Mashiach. 3 of them can bring him, but they don't necessarily have to happen for him to come. Means even if they're not used or done, he will come anyway, because there's a concept called be'itoi. Means there's a definite time that he will come, even if these ways are not utilized and so on. But there is one way, 1 out of the 4, that must happen, and I will explain that, which is really very surprising. So it's not an option, it will happen. And I will explain, of course, what that means and so on, Anyway, it all starts from a Medrash Rabbah. And it is an extension of what I've spoke about last year, which is the whole concept of Mishnayos. That people make a tremendous mistake about Limud HaTorah in the form of Mishnayos. And this is a Medrash Rabbah, which is obviously one of the most authentic Divrei Chazal, words of the rabbis and so on, And it's in Sefer Vayikra in Parshas Tzav, section 3. And here's what it says over there. Very, very interesting idea. I'll say it in Hebrew and then I will say it, of course, translate it. It says, Ein hagluyos miskansois, ela b'shvil schus limud mishnayos, which is incredible. What does that mean? That the exiles can only be gathered, which means the end of the Golus, right? That's obviously the beginning of the redemption. that the exile can only end only in the merit of learning Mishnayos. It doesn't say Gemara. It says Mishnayos. That's astounding. Why would that be? And that is not a statement or a condition that is optional. No, it says Ein Hagluyis Miskansois. It will only happen because of the merit of learning Mishnayos, which is remarkable. Why? You see, and what's so amazing, it doesn't say Gemara at all. It says Mishnayos, which today, when you think about it, hardly anybody learns. I mean, if it's a yortzeit, right, after somebody and so on, right, or a balabatim, regular lay people, so to speak. If they go to shul and the rabbi wants to give a shiur, so many times he will give it in Mishnayos as opposed to Daf Yomi or whatever. But that's it. And in yeshiva, it's also taught for 1 year, basically. Kids finish Chumash, and then they go on to Gemara a year or two later. But meanwhile, in between, they learn Mishnayos, and that's it. So how is it possible that the Medrash makes dependent the end of the exiles, which is the beginning of redemption? I mean, it's miraculous. That means all the Jews will gather together to come back to Eretz Israel, only because of learning Mishnayos. Now, I'm not going into how that will happen, but why does it have to happen? That's what I want to deal with. What's the logic of this? Or what is the redemptive principle that it's based on that does not make it an option, but makes it a necessity? And that is the question. And the answer is something which is really, in many ways, very, very important. Okay. We know that at the end of time, and I once mentioned this quite a while back, there's a pasuk in the Torah in Dvorim that says, Lo yishokach mipi zaroi, that the Torah will not be forgotten among the Jewish people. I mean, this is Moshe Rabbeinu talking to the Jewish people, that the Torah will not be forgotten. What do you mean it will not be forgotten? To what extent will it not be forgotten? It could be hardly forgotten, mostly forgotten, or almost completely forgotten. Forgotten has degrees. So, Lo yishokach, Rashi says, Lo yishokach legamri. It will not be completely forgotten. That's what the pasuk says. So Moshe Rabbeinu was saying a prophecy that no matter what the Jews do, no matter how many sins they commit or whatever, or no matter how severe the exile becomes, the Torah will not be completely forgotten. Yeah, but is this something to be okay, fine with? Of course not. Because for that prophecy to be fulfilled, all it has to be is one Jew remember his Torah, so it's not completely forgotten, and the other 99.9% of Jews forgot it, which means it's gone. You realize what that means? That means the Torah will essentially, even if not literally, but basically, figuratively, forgotten. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying this. And Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to console us with the fact that, okay, it'll be mostly forgotten, but not completely forgotten. Really? I mean, is that going to console me? So the question is, what does that mean? And so on. Why is that so? Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about the gezerah, the decree of the end. That's really what he's saying. That at the end of time, this is what's going to be. Which means that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us evil will proliferate beyond our imagination. You see, and in order for that to occur, Torah has to be mostly forgotten, because evil cannot exist in a world that is filled with Torah. Torah is compared to a light, Torah or, right? If you walk into a room that's pitch black, even with a little candle, that candle or that light from that candle will dispel a tremendous amount of light far beyond the substance of that candle. Like it says, Ma'at min ha'or, a little of the light, doiche, harbe min ha'choshech, you see, removes a great deal of darkness, which is very interesting, you see. So what that means is that light itself is an interference with the proliferation of evil. And in order for evil to proliferate at the end of time, most of Torah has to be forgotten. Because what it means is that tumah, defilement, and evil will be tremendously pervasive all over the world. And that's one of the ideas, you see. In other words, that's the concept what the Ramchal calls, Rabbi Mishnah, Tegboris Hora, the growth of evil, is a Exile at the end. And that is the concept of Loisi Shokach. Torah will not be completely forgotten. You see, and one of the ideas is to allow the evil to grow to such an extent. That's an important idea, you see. Now, why will that be? There are many reasons. One of them is measure for measure, midah keneged midah. What does that mean? Because if you defile the Torah by not observing it, right, for whatever reason, whatever your non-observance, contains and so on and so forth, then the punishment is measure for measure. God says, since you don't want my Torah, I'm going to take it away from you, right? Measure for measure, because that's what you want. So I'm going to remove it. Wait a minute. If you remove it, how am I going to do tshuva? How am I going to know what the correct way? Well, listen, that's justice. We create, you see, the darkness of the Torah, and that is the measure of justice. And that's one of the ideas. But the other idea, which I once mentioned a long time ago, is that that's on the bad side, but on the good side, in a certain sense anyway, we are not as culpable. Because if you were born into a generation that hardly has any Torah, you're not as guilty as you would be if you were in a generation in which there's a great deal of Torah and a great deal of Talmidei Chachomim, of scholars and so on. You are obviously held to a much higher standard, which is not good for you and the generation. So on the flip side, when Torah is gone, is that, well, what do you want from me? I don't know any Torah. It's not around even, right? So you're not as culpable. So that is one of the ways that God deals with the sins of the Jewish people, especially when they proliferate. So that's a very important idea, you see. So we now know something very important, that this is a situation, the environment, that we will find ourselves at the end of time. Enormous amount of non-spirituality, darkness, you see. And the interesting thing is that I heard a statistic, it used to be 40 years ago, or whatever, 50 years ago, whatever, that 50% of America, I think, or maybe even more, believed in God and were religious, whatever their religion was. And I heard that today it's down to, I think, 25% or something like that. So we find religion all over the world is really diminishing, right? And that's the darkness. I'm not even going into the Jewish religion, right? Because we know that the Jewish religion, right, 90% of the Jews are gone. It's just astounding, the absence of Torah, what it does to the Jews. In any case, we see this also as a forerunner by Yirmiyahu in Exile. Yirmiyahu says a very interesting pasuk. And of course, Yirmiyahu is bemoaning the destruction of the temple, which of course means the end of the presence of God openly, the way it was in the Beis Hamikdash. And Yirmiyahu is bemoaning that. So he says an interesting pasuk. He says in Echo, Soreha umalkeho bagoyim. It is so bad, it is such that Soreha, her princes, umalkeho, and her kings, bagoyim, are now captured by the goyim. This has become a real exile. And then Yirmiyahu says in Echo, ain't Torah. There's no Torah. V'gam nevi'er lo matzu chazoin. And even the prophets of the Jewish people, lo matzu chazoin, they don't find prophetic, information or prophetic situations and so on. It's all gone. So we see automatically that this is what happens, when you have the destruction of the temple and the Shekhinah is removed and so on. And that's very important, you see, because when there's destruction, certainly at the end of time, or at the end of a time that really replicates what's going to be at the end of time, totally, which we now live in, then everything goes into Golus. The Shekhinah goes into Golus, right? We don't see the presence of God. The Torah goes into the Golus. The Golus HaTorah, the exile of the Torah, is gone. The Jews go into Golus, and Eretz Yisrael goes into Golus. Those four things are one entity, as it says in Chazal, rabbis, Chadhu, they are one idea. All four go into Golus, not just one, Of course, one of the interesting things is the reverse, that when they begin to come out of Golus, you see, that's a very good sign, because it means that all of them will ultimately come out of Golus. And that's really what the Geula is, the redemption. And we see now, Eretz Yisrael, for instance, is now in the hands of the Jews. Of course, the Goyim are trying to take it away from us, and the Arabs and so on. But Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jews, and it's recognized by the entire world and so on, So we have Eretz Yisrael back. The Jews are also going out of Golus in the sense that they're no longer in the lands that capture them and enslave them and so on. And they are coming back from many countries in which they were in exile. That's number two. But the Torah is still in Golus, tremendously. And of course, the divine presence is still in Golus. And those things come back, those two entities come back, of course, when the real redemption happens. But this is what I'm referring to. So this is what Eicha, or Yirmiyahu HaNavi, says, right? In terms of all of them going to Golus. You see. Now, one of the ways which is very important to understand is the Shekhinah, the divine presence, has two essential properties. You see, it exhibits two essential properties in terms of what it is. What is that? What is the properties of the divine presence, the Shekhinah? Of course, it has many properties or characteristics, but there are two that really stand out. It's called Tiferes and Oiz, beauty and might. You see, it has beauty and might. What's beauty? Tiferes. Beauty is wisdom, omniscience. The Rebbeinu Shem knows everything. You see, there's nothing that's concealed or hidden from him. He has awesome, infinite Tiferes, beauty. And he has omnipotence, all-powerful, right? That's the Oiz. Tiferes and Oiz. Those are the essential properties of the Shekhinah, that God knows everything and God can do everything. Well, since we are a Chelek Elokai, we are part of God, which we know, right? So we also, the Jewish people, have those two properties. You see, Tiferes and Oiz, wisdom and might. Might can be seen not as necessarily a military power, but hatzlocha, tremendous success in whatever we do. And we have those, you see. So therefore, when the Jews go into Golus, That's what goes into the gullus, into exile, the teferes and ois. In fact, what's interesting is we say those two blessings. What do we say, right? In the Birchas HaShacha, in the morning. Oize Yisrael b'gvura, right? He girds Israel with strength. That's oiz. Oize Yisrael b'gvura, right? And oite Yisrael b'sifora. And he crowns them with teferes. You see? We have those two properties because we are part of God, as we know that from Chazal and so on, you know? And therefore, when the Jews go into exile, those are the two properties that go into exile, the teferes and the oiz. You see? And that's what we see in Tachnun, in the morning prayers. It says, Ad Mosai Uschu Bashvi. We ask God, Ad Mosai Uschu Bashvi. How long will your might, Uscho, your might, Bashvi, be in captivity? V'sif'altcho, and your beauty, right? Biatzo, in the hands of the enemy and so on, you know? Because those are the two essential features. And that really is the essential feature of the exile, isn't it? That we lack independence. We are in exile among the nations of the world that have done terrible things to the Jews for the last at least 2,000 years, or certainly since we were in Rome, which is 2,400 years ago, right, and so on, to be at the beck and call of the nations of the world, and how much interference they have posed toward the Jews and so on, you see. So this is the concept of Torah in Golus, you see. And this is what happens at the end of time, the concept of Golus. What's my point in bringing this out? That this will be the situation of the Golus, that the Geula, the essential act of redemption, is the redemption of Tferes and Oiz, of the Jewish people. And therefore, Torah will return. And in fact, even the Or HaChaim says that the essential nature of the redemption itself must be the concept called what? Called the redemption of the Torah. Because that, in many ways, is the essence of Klal Yisrael. God will bring it back. So that's the first idea. Now, the question is, and so on, but there's a second reason why God will bring back the Torah to Klal Yisrael. And what is that? And so on, I mentioned, I think was either the week before or I've mentioned it several times and so on and so forth. We have no concept of what the Messianic era will be. And also we have no concept of what who the Mashiach is and what type of person he will be. But I mentioned previously that it says, Hine Yaskel Avdi, it says in Yeshayahu, Perek Nun Beis, the 52 chapter toward the end. It says, Hine Yaskel Avdi, which is a prophecy, that behold, my servant will grow wise. Yaskil, Haskola, he will grow wise and so on. And it says 3 expressions of growth. Yaskil is what? Yoram, he will grow, he will rise. V'nisa, and he will lift. V'gova mi'oid, and will become exceedingly great. So the Medrash says, what does that mean? Why 3 expressions of growth? So the Medrash says that V'yoram, which is the first expression, means that he will be, right? He will be as great as Avram Avinu. Imagine that. We have no idea who Avram Avinu was and how great he was. But the Mashiach, and it's talking about basically the Mashiach ben Yosef and also the Mashiach ben David. But in any case, he will be as great or greater than Avram Avinu. Then it says Venisa, and he will be uplifted and so on. Means he will be as great or greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. We have no idea what Moshe Rabbeinu was. In many ways, he was a Superman, right? In terms of holiness and so on. So he will be greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. So then what is V'gova Me'oid? Who's that? He's already greater than Moshe. And the answer is he will be greater than the angels. So could you imagine a Messiah that is greater than the Malachim walking around amongst us? The Rosham, which is begin to realize, wants to bring the Torah back to the Jews. Because the Jews are a prince. Could you imagine introducing your son, the prince, to important dignitaries in filthy clothing, right? That he just got off being off Skid Row, right? And he's on drugs, right? And not only that, but he's also drunk. Could you imagine introducing him, your son, to the dignitaries in your kingdom? Of course not. You know how embarrassing that is? So could you imagine the Jewish people being introduced to the Mashiach with that incredible Holy Spirit and that the return of the Shekhinah, right? The divine presence in the Beis HaMikdash, and 90% of the Jews are going to meet the God, the Shekhinah, and meet the Mashiach in that state? That's beyond belief. What a degrading situation. So the Rebbeinu Shalom will not allow that. So how do you restore the Jews to greatness? And the answer is you must restore the Jews to their Torah substantially. That's what it means, you see. Because therefore Torah, for many reasons, must be restored to the Jewish people. That is the real redemption. So therefore, they can now enter the Messianic era as proper, as according to their honor and their real dignity, right? So this is what we see. But the question is, how? How? I mean, God can do it miraculously like he did to Moshe Rabbeinu. He taught Moshe Rabbeinu the entire law of the Torah, all of it, which is basically almost infinite, in 40 days. It's not a problem for God. He can alter the brain. He can do whatever he wants, you see? But it's not going to happen because the Jews brought the redemption through suffering and not because of righteousness. So therefore the whole Messianic process will happen al yidei teva. Teva means naturally, which is exactly what's happening now. That things are changing radically, naturally, because the Jews are bringing the tikkun, the rectification, through suffering, which is, by the way, the same way they did it in Egypt. That's how they brought Moshe Rabbeinu through their suffering for 210 years and so on. So therefore, the Mashiach, all of this has to proceed in a natural way. Yeah, but wait a minute, how can that happen? Well, there's something that you have to understand about Torah, okay, which I think most people don't realize. There is a statement in Chazal that Talmud Torah keneged kulam, right? It says that in the morning davening, that Torah keneged kulam is as great as all the mitzvahs combined. It is the greatest of all mitzvahs. And if you weigh them, the Torah on one side, all 612 mitzvahs on the other, right, is greater. Question is, what does that mean? Okay, so one of the things that you have to understand is that we are chelik l'kai mimal. We are like God. And what that means is that God is in many ways is very interesting. God doesn't act, he wills. We don't realize that. God doesn't do anything. He doesn't have to get his hands into the work and so on. No, he doesn't do that. God wills, he thinks. I mean, that's the way we understand it. He thinks. Of course, God doesn't think. We don't know how a God operates. We're not getting into that and so on, you know. But God doesn't act, he wills. The will is the act, you see. And that's why you see in the beginning of Bereshis, Vayomer Elokim, and God said, let there be light. And Vahiyon, there was light. What do you mean? But it doesn't say he acted and God acted in that sense, right? Although that could be later, right? It says, and he said. Well, he said is an expression of his will. And all of a sudden there was light. So without getting into how God does these things, because God is existence per se, and when he wills, he infuses existence into something. Without getting into that and so on, believe it or not, the Jewish people have that power also. Since we are part of God, when we will, when we think, when we engage our mind in something, that is the equivalent of acting. Oh, you see, we are the only ones that can do that, which is amazing when you think about that. And in a certain sense, we are Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Therefore, we now understand what does it mean by Talmud Torah, Keneged Kulam. What does that mean? That Talmud Torah, learning Torah, weighs more in value, was greater in holiness and so on, than all mitzvahs combined. Why? Because Torah has a unique feature. When you learn Torah, so you get a mitzvah of learning Torah. But whatever you're learning about, you do. You actually do. It's an act. Now, we don't know exactly how that works, but the Medrash says, which I quoted, all right, why is it that Mishnayos will bring the redemption, right? And we know that the redemption must be on Torah, because what God wants is you to learn Torah, and it's as if you did the Torah, all of it. Right, that's why. And the Medrash brings down a famous pasuk. It says, Zeis Torah Chatos, and this is the law of the Chatos. So the Chazal learn that if you learn about the sacrifice, the offering called Chatos, sin offering, it's as if you brought a sin offering without bringing. Learning about a sin offering, or any korban for that matter, is equivalent or tantamount to doing it. You see, but how? And the answer is that's what Torah is. That by learning about it, thinking about it, you do it. What's the quickest way, therefore, for you to do the entire Torah? And the answer is to learn Torah. That means if you learn about the Torah, it will be the equivalent of having done. It's called asiyah. You will have actually done all the mitzvahs. You see, you learned about it, so that's equivalent to having done it. But wait a minute. It takes years to learn Torah. But the interesting thing is that the only part of Torah that you could do that will replicate that is Mishnayos. There's 4,192 Mishnayos. That's how many there are. And that is the totality of Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law. Imagine, according to what I'm saying, and this Medrash, that if you learn Mishnayos, not only will you have learned the entire oral law, basic ideas, but you will have done the entire oral law. That means you will actually have done 613 commandments. And when I mean done. You do it. And we learn that from the Chatos. If you learn about Chatos, the sin offering, it's as if you brought the sin offering. Wow, that's incredible. If you learn 6 Mishnayos a day, out of the 4,192, you will finish the entire oral law in less than 2 years. So could you imagine and you will have done not only the mitzvahs that can be done today, all those mitzvahs that can't be done today. For instance, all the sacrifices, all the laws of Tumah V'Tara, purities. And if you're not a farmer, you don't give Truma, right? You don't give the tithe and so on. But if you learn about Truma, the tithe, it's as if you gave the tithe. To learn Mishnayos is the only way, right, to actually do all 613 mitzvahs, even those mitzvahs that cannot be done today, right? Because we lack the Beis HaMikdash and so on. I mean, did you ever hear anything like that? And you could do it in 2 years. There is a way of actually not only learning the entire Torah, but doing asiyah, performing the entire 630 mitzvahs. How? By learning Mishnayos. Because that's the power. That's why the Medrash says, now we begin to understand, wait a minute, if Mishnayos, which is the factual aspect of the Torah, it doesn't have give and take like the Gemara, you see, but it's all about the laws, the halachas itself of the entire oral law. So could you imagine learning about the entire oral law? Just the facts, just the 613 commandments. And you do it in 2 years? That means that's the equivalent, right, of performing 613 commandments. And guess what? If that's the case, then the Mashiach will be very proud of meeting you, right? Because you will be an incredible holy person, incredible scholar. Therefore, Mishnayos, as the Medrash says, and that's what I'm quoting, Mishnayos says that Ein Hagluyis Miskansois, the exiles can only be gathered only because of the merit of learning Mishnayos. Because God wants you to meet the Mashiach being an unbelievable scholar, and you will be, because God will infuse unbelievable success in not only understanding with clarity and mastery, right, but in retaining and knowing these 613 commandments. And that's what the Medrash means. And it brings down the idea of chatos, that if you learn about sin offering, it's as if you did it. It brings that down as the answer. That's why. Because it fulfills the requirement that you will be a tremendous scholar if you do it. It's a fascinating concept. And therefore, the Mashiach can actually happen, you see. So imagine that you know this in the entire Torah in less than 2 years, you see. Now, of course, God has to make it possible. We don't really know exactly how that will happen, but remember, it has to happen through teva, through natural means. What natural means can there be? You know, well, we can understand what it means to learn Mishnayos, but there are ways. And I said in the last year something very important, that you have to understand there are two paths in learning the Torah. One path is called Yediyah, to know the law, to know the facts of the Torah, and that's Mishnayos. There are no problems in Mishnayos. There's just facts, Yediyah, knowledge, right? So that's one path. And I want to tell you something. Today, there are many forms of Mishnayos that a person can learn just the facts. And with all these pharma on Mishnayos and so on, you can actually learn the entire oral law, all of it, because it brings down all the missing facts that the Mishnayos don't. So you could become a massive Talmid Chacham just from Mishnayos. And there's certain very good ones. We know Art Scroll, for instance, has 3 different types of Mishnayos. And then there's a Mishnayos called Siyata Dishmaya, which is one of the best, probably is the best, Mishnayos, you know, because he brings down all the information that the Mishnayos leaves out. So you come away with a tremendous broad mastery of not only the Mishnah, but what's missing in the Mishnah, and also what's called the Shita, the opinions of the Rishonim, the Achronim, and even the Halacha is included and so on. And there are many Mishnayos now that we never had 50 years ago and so on. In fact, Rabbi Aryeh Levine wrote a commentary to the Mishnah on many Masechtas and so on. And in it he says, and he tries to bring down a lot of the facts, that it's actually possible for a person to become a master of the oral law without Gemara. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you should not learn Gemara. Of course not. Of course, Gemara is an essential aspect of learning and so on, you see. But it is possible by specializing in Mishnayos which is amazing, especially with all these forums that talk about all the missing information and so on, to become a master of the oral law, really without learning Gemara. Of course, Gemara is essential because it's part of the oral law and so on, and so on. But think about that. You can learn the entire Shulchan Aruch and be a posek, to a certain extent anyway, without Gemara. Because the Shulchan Aruch has an enormous amount of details. And today, there's an enormous amount of proliferation, especially with the Mishnah Brura and all the commentaries and so on. You can know an enormous amount of psak as facts and so on. And then, of course, afterwards, you learn Gemara and so on. So that is a tremendous path to becoming a tremendous Talmid Chacham and so on. So that's what the Medrash says. This is a very important concept. The concept of Mishnah as being a prerequisite for the redemption itself. And this is a Medrash Rabbah that actually says, remember, we're not talking here about an option. There are ways that are optional, but Mishnayos apparently is not optional. This is the way Torah will be returned. Through the concept of Mishnayos, and that's what that Midrash says, and so on. Okay, so that is one way that the redemption can be realized, and so on. And exactly how, it's not easy to figure out, and so on, But there are ways. One of the ways, I think, is what I had mentioned last week, is the concept of Mishnaic maps, that you can actually create a map of every single halacha in that Masechta, arranged based on their relationship, like you look at a map. And therefore the human mind loves when you look at the big picture first, and then you go down into the details, but you see it from the standpoint of a visual representation, and so on. So how long does it take to memorize a map that has the totality of all the ideas? Not long, you see. So this concept of Mishnaic maps is an interesting way to actually succeed in learning the entire oral law easily in 2 years, and so on. In any case, it's certainly worthwhile thinking about, and so on. Now, the second way of bringing the Mashiach, which actually happened, was Egypt. Lashon Hara. Speaking slander. Right. Now, the Medrash says 3 times, again, we know it from the Medrash, Lo niga lo Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. The only reason why the Jews were redeemed from Egypt, Ela b'shvil, only because of Lo hoyu bahem diltuya. There was no gossipers. They did not speak Lashon Hara. The Medrash says this 3 times, you see, which is incredible. That means what the merit of the Jews to get out of Egypt, which is the first Golus and so on, was because nobody spoke Lashon Hara. It doesn't say how or why. Why didn't they speak Lashon Hara? Well, how did people know not to speak Lashon Hara? It doesn't say, but it does say this is why they got out. Now, the question, of course, we have to ask ourselves is, why? And the answer is the unique feature of Lashon Hara. I once mentioned that it's an entire shiur that you could look up on Torah Anytime or YouTube or whatever, so on, that Lashon Hara has a unique power. If you speak Lashon Hara, you open up your portfolio or file of sins, and the Satan is able to pull one out and prosecute you. Lashon Hara exposes your entire dossier, so to speak, of sins. So every time you speak Lashon Hara or listen to Lashon Hara, right, your file of sins is exposed to the Makatreg, the great prosecuting attorney in heaven, who is the Satan, and he therefore can pull out one, basically for at least every sentence or every word, whatever. He can prosecute you once. If you say 2 sentences of Lashon Hara, he can prosecute you twice. So essentially, when you speak Lashon Hara, you are exposing all your sins to a prosecuting attorney in heaven, the Satan, to prosecute you and therefore to punish you. That's the power of Lashon Hara. Here was the problem. The Jews are in Egypt. Why? We know why. Because it says in the beginning of the exile in Egypt, in Shmos, Moshe Rabbeinu sees one Jew hitting another Jew. And he says to him, why are you hitting your fellow Jew? So that person said, who made you the boss? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? So Moshe Rabbeinu says a very strange statement. Surely the matter is known. And what that means, the pshat, meaning that surely this matter that I killed the Egyptian is going to be known to Pharaoh, Paroi, because this guy is going to inform on me, which is what happened. But Rashi says that's not what the Medrash says. What Moshe Rabbeinu really said was, now I understand why the Jews are in exile for so many years. Surely the matter is known. The reason why is because the Jews worshipped idols in Egypt. But since they talk Lashon Hara all the time, because that's what this guy is now going to talk Lashon Hara about me, that I killed the Egyptian, is because they talk Lashon Hara, this sin of Lashon Hara, of Avodah Zorah, of worshipping idols, is now going to be known to the Satan. And because of that, he prosecutes. And because of that, Mida Keneged Mida, you want to worship a different deity? You want to give power to another being? Guess what? If that's what you believe that there's, Avodah Zorah, that there are idols that have power, then I'm going to give power by other people to be over you, to dominate you, measure for measure. Because that's what Avodah Zorah does. It puts you into golus. Because that's what you believe. You believe that other beings besides me have power. And guess what? You will be dominated by other people. Because you believe that they have power. It's Mida Keneged Mida, measure for measure. Therefore, the fact that they speak Lashon Hara is what got them into Egypt in the first place, based on that Medrash about Moshe Rabbeinu in the beginning of Shmos. You see. So as long as they were worshipping idols and speaking Lashon Hara, this was a constant prosecution in heaven. So how are the Jews going to get out? You see. So finally the Rebbe Hashem says, look, I want to get them out now. Why? Because they're about to fall in the 50th level of Tumah, and I want to take them out before they fall, because if they fall into the 50th level of defilement, I won't be able to take them out because they won't deserve it, whatever. But here's the problem. The problem is that they're supposed to be there 400 years, and they're only there 210. So the Satan is screaming and said, you can't take them out. They have not fulfilled the amount of time that they have to be there, you see, as an atonement for whatever and so on, So what the Rebbe Hashem needed is that the Jewish people not speak Lashon Hara. And if they don't talk Lashon Hara, then the Satan doesn't know. So if he doesn't know, he can't prosecute. Because the ability of him to know and prosecute depends on Lashon Hara, right? That's the astounding power of slander and gossip, bad-mouthing your fellow Jew and so on. But what happened? So the Jews did not speak Lashon Hara. And because they did not speak Lashon Hara, no prosecutions. So the Rebbe Hashem could now take them out without having to defend his actions against a prosecuting angel, you see. And therefore they were able to get out of Egypt after 210 years and not wait 400 years. You see, that's the logic. In fact, the Rebbe Hashem says something very interesting. The Jews at the Red Sea, they were doing what? They were speaking Lashon Hara against God. What'd you do? You took us out to do what? God took us out to do what? To die in the desert? What's wrong? There were not enough graves in Egypt that you had to take us out? It's Lashon Hara against God. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, wait a minute, stop it. Because you're now going to reinvigorate the Satan to prosecute you. Because that's what gets him to know. You see, in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Hashem yilochem yilochem, that God will do what? He will He will fight for you. V'atem tachrishon, but you have to be silent. What do you mean, be silent? Why? Because you're talking Lashon Hara. And the whole reason why you got out is because you didn't speak Lashon Hara, so the Sultan can't prosecute. But it's if you start this business all over again with speaking Lashon Hara, then he will know that you're getting out in that sense. And bam-o, it opens up the prosecution because that's his permission slip to prosecute. Don't do that. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, V'atem tachrishon, be silent. Amazing. It's the exact idea what it means and so on, you see. So therefore the Jews stopped. You see. In fact, there's a Klei Yokah, one of the great commentaries of the Chumash, that actually talks about this. That when Moshe Rabbeinu was at the Sneh, was at the burning bush, so the Rebbe Shem told Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to take out my people. I want you to take them out. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, what do you mean? Maybe they won't believe me. Which means that, what was Moshe Rabbeinu saying? He says, you can't take them out. Why? And the Klei Yokah says this. Because the whole reason why they're in there is because of the Lashon Hara. And they still speak Lashon Hara. So there's always prosecution. So how can I take them out? Because justice demands that they don't go out. So the Moshe said, no, they do not speak Lashon Hara anymore. That's where Moshe Rabbeinu found out, because he was gone for 54 years, right? He was in Ethiopia, wherever. And the Moshe informed him that the Jews do not speak Lashon Hara. That's amazing. Therefore, there's no prosecutions, and therefore, take them out. I can now take them out because I don't have to defend my actions, right, against the prosecuting angels and so on. You see, the Klei Yokah says this. That's the whole pshat of what was the dialogue between Moshe and the Moshe said. In other words, even though you're right, that was why they got into Egypt in the first place. Surely the matter is known. That is not what's happening now. And therefore you can go and take them out, which is, when you think about that, is fascinating and so on, you know. You just have to look at the, take them out. Take a look at the Klei Yokah and so on, you know. Therefore, what do we see? That the reason why we are in Golos is because our sins are constantly exposed to the Satan, and he prosecutes us, you see. But what happens, what exposes us all the time? And the answer is Lashon Hara, harmful speech. This is what does it, you see. But if you do not speak Lashon Hara, right, what do you think it says? Mi oisha chofetz chaim, who wants to live long, right? Right? Guard your tongue from speaking evil and so on, right? Because if you don't speak Lashon Hara, then what happens? You're not prosecuted. Because the major way the Satan can prosecute any Jew for his sins is he exposes those sins to the Satan by Lashon Hara. But if you do not speak Lashon Hara, it is incredibly difficult for him to prosecute you. The Dubna Maggid says this in the Oil Yaakov, that it's almost impossible for the Satan to prosecute you if you do not speak Lashon Hara. And that is why the Torah promises you a long life. Right? So the Chofetz Chaim says this, that if you do not speak Lashon Hara, one of the ways of ending the exile, and well, you know what that means, it's not just ending the exile, it's ending all the anti-Semitism, all the terrible tragedy of the Jewish people in exile, right? All the terrible tumah and everything. One of the ways of ending that, and building the Beis HaMikdash, and bringing the Mashiach and the Shekhinah, the divine presence, back, is do not speak Lashon Hara, because that's what got the Jews out of Egypt. You can imagine that? To get them out of Egypt after 210 years, because they didn't talk Lashon Hara. Like I said, the Medrash says this 3 times, that's why they got out of Egypt. So if all the Jews did not speak Lashon Hara, if there was a mass movement among the Jewish people not to speak Lashon Hara, they would get out of the exile. It would happen just like it happened in Egypt, right? You see. So that's what I'm saying. So not speaking Lashon Hara is a second way of ending the exile, just like it happened in Egypt. You see. A third way is to observe two Shabbosim. That's a famous way. As it says, if the Jews observe two Shabbosim, they would be redeemed. What we have to ask ourselves is basically why? Why is that? And the answer to that is something which most people don't know. What exactly is Shabbos? And I will say it. I once gave a whole shiur on this, and I will say it. Do you know what Shabbos really is? The secret of Shabbos is based on this Chazal, Rabbi. What is it? Where it says, the Rebbe tells Moshe Rabbeinu, go and tell the Jewish people that I have a matana toiva, a great gift for them. I have a great gift for them in my storehouse. And tell the Jews, what is that gift? Shabbos, right? Now, what we have to ask ourselves is, excuse me, why is that called a gift? Right? If Shabbos is a gift, then every mitzvah is a gift. Right? Why is Shabbos called a gift and not other mitzvahs? And the answer is, what is Shabbos really? So what I once said, and I have a whole shiur on that, is what? Is that normally if somebody does a job, he gets paid after he does the job, right? That's normal. You don't get paid before you do the job, right? You don't get paid for that. You get paid after. So what the Rebbe wanted, and I'm going to be brief about this, is he said, no, I want to give the Jews a taste of what the future world is like. Yeah, but you don't get that until after the job is done. The job is the tikkun, to do all the mitzvahs, and then you get the reward of Olam Haba. As the Moshe said, no, I'm going to show the Jews what Olam Haba is like before they finish the job. You see, what is the world like? Because remember, you don't have to give them Olam Haba, you do have to give them a taste of a spiritual world beyond this world. And we know that this world is what's called Olam Asiyah, the world of performance, whatever, action. Then there's Olam Yetzirah, the world of formation, which is a spiritual world in which there are angels. Could you imagine if all of a sudden you could go into Olam Yetzirah, which is a spiritual world, experiencing that before you die? It's incredible, because you are actually getting the reward by experiencing a different world, a spiritual world called Olam Yetzirah. You see. So the Rebbe said, yes, I want to give them a taste of Olam Yetzirah. And that's Kedusha, holiness. You see, that's really what you feel when Shabbos comes. You can't look into Olam Yetzirah, but you could feel something different. There's a special feeling that you get when Shabbos comes. And that feeling is the beginning of an experience called Olam Yetzirah. That's Shabbos. So the seventh day, because Olam Yetzirah, the next world, and this is after the Messianic world, okay, that experience is the experience of the beginning of a different spiritual universe called Olam Yetzirah. That's really what Shabbos is. It's not Olam Haba yet, but it is a meta world beyond the physical world called this world. And that's Shabbos. That's why it's a gift, because we didn't even finish the job, right? And if we didn't finish the job, if that's the case, why are we getting it? That's why it's called a matana, a gift. Because the Rebbe said, look, I don't want you just to have to wait until the end of time. No, I'm going to allow you every seventh day to experience what a spiritual world feels like in a semblance, in a certain way. That's Kedusha Shabbos, you see. Therefore, when you observe Shabbos, what are you really observing? You are saying, I believe that this world will someday become spiritual. That's a statement of emunah. By demonstrating and living, observing Shabbos, right? You are testifying to what? That I believe that the world on the 7,000th year, because that's when it happens, Olam Yetzirah and so on, I believe that this will happen. And that's really the whole purpose of the avodah, of doing the work, is to observe the commandments and therefore going into a higher dimension, transforming your body into a higher body, a spiritual body. So by observing Shabbos, right, you are actually testifying that I believe that this is what's going to happen. You see, that what's going to happen is that I am actually going to transform my physical body into a spiritual body, which is really angelic and so on, of Olam Yetzirah. And that's what you experience on Shabbos. So by doing it, two of them, because when you do something twice, that's a certification that you really believe. See, then you are really testifying that I believe in the entire divine plan, that the whole purpose is to go from this world into a spiritual domain with a spiritual body. Well, wow, if that's the case, then guess what? You will bring the Messianic age because you are testifying to that which you need to testify to. You see, this is the concept of that if you observe two Shabbosim, you are ultimately testifying to the divine plan, where when you do the mitzvahs, you actually move from a physical body to a spiritual body of the next world. And of course, as time proceeds, you will be moving your body through the different worlds until you finally get to Olam Haba, which is a complete transformation of the physical body into a spiritual body, right? But you don't have to get to the end, Olam Haba. All you have to do is move into the next spiritual domain, right? Which is after the physical. And that's essentially, in a very short statement and so on, a short explanation of why observing two Shabbosim will get you into bring the Messianic era, because that's your testimony and so on. So that is the third way of bringing the Mashiach, you see. And then the fourth way, of course, is what's called tshuva, is repentance. Because what is repentance? What does really God want? He wants you to observe His commandments. Why? Because that demonstrates to you that you believe that His will is dominant. His will is the only will. And by doing a mitzvah, you admit to that His will is the only will, and therefore you will observe His commandments. But what happens if you sin? Right? If you repent, what are you really repenting? That I made a mistake. I thought my will was also important, and if I could do whatever I want. And that's the sin, to violate His commandment. So when you repent, when you do tshuva, what you're really saying is, I have charata, I regret, and I now retestify or change my testimony that my will is really nullified, in front of His will. His will is the only will. Besides God, there is nothing else. Only God, the only will that has any kind of existence, is His will. And I want to testify to that. That's tshuva. Oh, you're doing tshuva, which means you regret that you rebelled against God, that you held yourself to be equal to Him, and therefore you could do what you want. Nope, you're having charata, you're having regret, and that's the essence of tshuva, is charata, is regret, and therefore you are testifying that Einoi Mavadoi, He's the only one that exists, His will is the only will that exists, right? And therefore I will do what He says. And when all the Jews do tshuva, when they repent, essentially they are doing the tikkun. That is the tikkun. That brings God back, because we now testify that He is the only being and His will is the only will. And therefore we get measure for measure. We will experience His being. And we will actually see that His will is the only will. And that, of course, is Olam Haba and so on. So that also fulfills the plan and brings the Mashiach. Okay, I have now told you 4 ideas. But what's interesting about, so you have the concept of Lashon Hara. Don't speak Lashon Hara. Get others not to speak. But you must learn the halachas of Lashon Hara to know exactly what it is and what it is not, and so on. Shabbos, why Shabbos works, because ultimately you testify that there is other worlds besides this that eventually you will go into, because that's the world of reward, and therefore Shabbos is a matana, a gift. and then there's tshuva. You see, these are all possible to bring Mashiach, but they're optional in the sense that, of course, they should be done. But Mashiach will come even if the Jews don't do this, because Be'itoi, God promised, swore that ultimately Mashiach must come. But the first way I told you about is Mishnahs, which is astounding when you think about that, that God must have the Jews learn the Torah, because that will restore Torah greatness to the Jewish people, so they could face the Mashiach with tremendous dignity and honor and respect and so on, you see, that they will be Talmidei Chachomim. And the Medrash says very simply, the way to do it is with Mishnahs, because Mishnahs, learning Torah, is unique in that not only does it give you the mitzvah of Limud Torah, to learn the Torah, it is unique in the fact that you do the Torah, you perform the mitzvahs. It's unique because we replicate God in the fact that even if we think about a mitzvah, it's as if we did it. Because God has that feature and so on, you know. So we also have that feature. And that's the greatness of Torah. And the quickest way that we could know the Torah, learn the Torah, right, and have done the entire Torah, even the Torah that is no longer performed today, because it's all theoretical, all of it can actually be done by us based on that medrash, like a chatos, a sin offering. If you learn about the sin offering, it's as if you did it, which means it has those two components, which you think about as astounding. So, imagine, you learn the Torah, 6 Mishnahs a day, you finish the entire Torah in less than 2 years. What's 2 years out of your life? Nothing. You're probably walking around, having been in yeshiva for 20 years, and what are you? You're 40, 50, whatever. Well, what do you really know? And so on. Imagine you can make up for lost time, I hate to put it that way, and so on, by learning Mishnahs. But you must learn it be'iyun. You have to learn it in depth, not superficial, and really make us what's called a seder, make a time period where you will learn the Mishnahs, right? And you're going to learn it be'iyun in depth and really try to understand it and master the Mishnahs, you see. And that will enable you to say, not only do I know the whole Torah, I have actually done all of the Torah as mitzvahs. It's astounding, you see. And what that will do is fulfill the return of the Torah, you see. And as a result of that, the Mashiach could come. And of course, there are many other ideas that one can say. If Klal Yisrael knows their Torah, do you imagine if the Jewish people knew their Torah the way they knew it in what's called the Dor HaMidbar, the generation of the desert by Moshe Rabbeinu, when all Jews knew the Torah? In fact, and I will end with this, Chizkiyahu HaMelech, Ezekiel, Ezekiel, however they say it in English, Chizkiyahu HaMelech, right? It says that God wanted to make him Mashiach. And Sancherev, who he fought, right? Sancherev to be Goig, right? And his nation would be Magoig. And I once spoke about that of course that can happen, and so on. But and Sancherev, we know, of course, attacked the Jews, and God wiped out the entire army, right? In one night, he killed 183,000. This is reported in Tanakh, right? He killed them all, right? And because he wanted to make Chizkiyahu the Mashiach. He wanted actually, but why? Why was Chizkiyahu Zoicha to actually be a candidate to be Mashiach? Because that's what it says. And you know why? Because it says in the time of Chizkiyahu, he said to the Jewish people, you need to learn Torah. And he took out a sword and he said, whoever doesn't learn Torah, right, gets killed. So it says that the Torah was mastered by everybody, that they even checked out a kid, right? They found every kid, a kid in Klal Yisrael. Every one kid was a master in the laws of purity, of Tumah V'Tara, Now, there was no Gemara in the time of Chizkiyahu at all. It was all what's called, like I said, factual learning, which is Mishnayos. There was no Gemara that they could use as a text. Of course, they had debates amongst themselves, but that's any discussion you have about the laws of Torah. But there was no official text of Gemara at all. It was only Mishnayos. There were law books, right, that had the facts. That there was no Shakavatari, there was no give and take arguments, a textbook that actually had that. It was only facts, you see. And in fact, what did Klal Yisrael do before the Mishnayos, right? Before the Gemara. So before Gemara, there was Mishnayos. But what they learned before Mishnayos, they learned what's called Sifra, Mechilta. That's called the drushes themselves, which is basically Mishnayos, whatever, and so on. But that they only learned facts. Of course, they had debate amongst themselves, but there was no text from which they could learn, you see. But that was the equivalent of a Mishnayos in those days. And Chizkiyahu got every single Jew to be a master of the oral law. Could you imagine what that means? And therefore, since Chizkiyahu brought Klal Yisrael to this unbelievable mastery of the Torah through the limit of a factual text called, well, let's call it Mishnayos, whatever, and so on, right? He was worthy of being a possible contender for being the Messiah, the Mashiach himself. That's why. And he fulfilled the medrash that says the exiles will only happen, right? Which it did, right? They will only be gathered in the merit of Mishnayos, which is learning the Torah as facts and mastering the entire oral law. It's astounding. Now we see the connection. So God did what he will do in the exile. He killed 183,000 soldiers of Sancheiriv, the war of Gog and Magog, because Chizkiyahu was zoicha, merited, you see, to be a possible Mashiach. Unfortunately, he wasn't. Why? Because he did not sing Shira. He didn't sing Shira, song, praised of God, for the unbelievable miracle of an entire army being wiped out by a malach. That's obviously how it happened, because there's no disease in the world that can wipe out an army of 183,000 people in one night. You see, he should have sang Shira in recognition of the unbelievable miracle that God did. He didn't. And because of that, he lost the opportunity. But what I'm trying to bring is why he was even designated, because he restored Klal Yisrael to its greatness, you see, and that greatness would have been the Messianic era, because he actually made sure that every kid, forget about the adults, was a master of the oral law. How? Through the learning of facts, which is the obviously equivalent of Mishnayos. Anyways, something to think about, these four ideas, but especially think about getting into Mishnayos be'iyun, in depth, and it's not difficult. It's very easy to memorize Mishnayos, and there's a whole way to do it, and so on, you know, to memorize that. And the idea, the knowledge that you will have is beyond belief, because Mishnayos on average has 8 halachas in each Mishnah, right? 8 halachas. And there are 4,192 Mishnayos. So there's approximately 33,000 halachas, or yediyos, facts, in Mishnayos. But Mishnayos is missing a lot of material. So therefore, if you add all the missing material, then Mishnayos has over 100,000 facts of the oral law. Right? That's how much there is in Mishnayos. And certainly if you learn with all the commentaries that are now available, you will actually know over 100,000 yediyos, knowledge, facts of the entire oral law. And by the way, Mishnayos is 40% of Shas, right? Because if you know the Mishnah by heart, take it out, right? Take out every place it says a Mishnah, because you know it. Then take out every place it says in the Gemara, B'hotanan, and we learn in the Mishnah. Well, guess what? You know that too. And every Boraisa, every Tanya, is basically 80% Mishnah and 20% Chidush, novel, idea. So take that out. So what are you left with? 60% of Shas, because you now know 40. Just from the Mishnahs. Imagine if you had that as a framework before you even got into Gemara. Before you learned the Gemara, you actually knew the totality of the Mishnahs of that Masechta, and you knew it in depth, right? You'd be incredible just from that. So I would certainly encourage, if you want to bring Mashiach, and this is not an option, by the way, the Medrash says, Ein hagluyis miskansois. It won't happen unless the Jews learn Mishnahs. It's not me, it's the Medrash itself, and it brings the proof why and so on. Any case, let's hope that certainly all of this will happen in whatever form and so on, and the Klal Yisrael will certainly be redeemed. And we are now, you should know, obviously, in the generation of the redemption, because we take a look at what the Rebbe Shem did, an absolute miracle, where he gave good the ability to dominate evil, and we know what that means politically and so on, that America will change. The entire world is now buckling under Trump, obviously, and we're all afraid of Trump and so on. Trump will get rid of the swamp, and he will usher in a time of much greater goodness and hopefully even righteousness in the world. And I think even he will end the Arab-Israeli conflict, obviously, because we're all frightened in terms of what he's going to do and so on. So what the main idea is, we've never seen such an overturning of evil. We've never seen that in years. And all of a sudden it happened, you see, by this individual and so on and so forth. So that tells us in heaven, evil lost. In the Bezdin, in heaven, the heavenly court, the Satan lost. That doesn't mean he's not functioning, but he lost big time, because now the world is headed in the direction of correcting evil to a tremendously great extent. So let's hope that means that's a sign that God is going to usher in the Messianic era and restore Torah greatness to the Jewish people. And certainly let's hope that happens soon. Thank you.